In the autumn of 1932, a young woman walked into St. Mary's Hospital in rural Virginia, her belly swollen with child. The nurses whispered among themselves as she checked in under a false name, her hands trembling as she signed the admissions forms. What they didn't know, what no one could have possibly imagined, was that the child growing inside her womb would become medical history's most horrifying case study. A living testament to secrets so dark, so twisted that the family involved would spend decades trying to bury the truth. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The child born that cold November night wasn't just physically deformed. The medical records sealed for over 60 years and only recently uncovered through a Freedom of Information Act request reveal something far more disturbing. The infant's DNA told a story that would make hardened geneticists question everything they thought they knew about human heredity. This wasn't just inbreeding. This was generations of it. Layer upon layer of genetic isolation so complete that when doctors finally mapped the family tree, they discovered something that shouldn't exist in nature. The mother, who we'll call Sarah, had no identification when she arrived. She spoke in a dialect so thick and archaic that even the local nurses struggled to understand her. Her clothing was handmade. Her skin bore the telltale signs of a life lived far from modern civilization. But it was her eyes that unsettled the staff most, vacant, unfocused, as if she existed in a world the rest of us had never seen. What happened in that delivery room on November 15, 1932, would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The attending physician, Dr. Margus Red Hayes, would later write in her private journal that she had delivered thousands of bobbies in her career, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for what emerged from Sarah's womb. The child lived for exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes that would change medical science forever. But this story doesn't begin with Sarah, and it certainly doesn't end with her unnamed child. To understand what really happened in that hospital room, we need to travel back almost 2 centuries to a remote valley in the Appalachian Mountains, where a single family's dark secret would grow like a cancer generation after generation, until it produced the most genetically compromised human being ever documented. The Holloway family first settled in what locals called Devil's Hollow in 1847. Jacob Holloway, a man fleeing debts and whispers of scandal in Pennsylvania, brought his wife Martha and their 7 children into the isolated valley with nothing but 2 wagons and a determination to disappear from civilized society forever. What he found there was perfect for his purposes: a natural fortress of stone walls and dense forest, accessible only through a single narrow pass that could be easily watched and defended. Jacob wasn't just running from creditors. Court records from Philadelphia, discovered only in 2019 during a university research project, reveal that he had been accused of unnatural relations with his own daughters. The charges were dropped when key witnesses mysteriously withdrew their testimonies, but the damage to the family's reputation was irreversible. So Jacob packed up his secrets and his shame and headed for the mountains where no one would ever ask questions again. The valley itself seemed cursed from the beginning. Previous settlers had abandoned it after only a few seasons, claiming the land was wrong somehow. Local Cherokee had avoided the area for generations, calling it the place where spirits grow sick. But Jacob saw only opportunity in the isolation. Here, his family could live by their own rules, answer to no authority but his own, and keep their bloodline pure in ways that would make even him shudder. In his later years, Martha Holloway bore Jacob 3 more children in that valley before she died under suspicious circumstances in 1854. The local sheriff, such as he was, rode out to investigate but found the family so hostile and the terrain so treacherous that he simply marked it down as death by fever and never returned. What he didn't know was that Martha had discovered something about her husband's nighttime visits to their daughter, Aben, and that her death had been anything but natural. With Martha gone, Jacob's control over the family became absolute. He instituted what he called the natural order, a system of arranged marriages between siblings and cousins that would keep the Holloway blood concentrated and the family's secrets locked away from the outside world. The eldest daughter, Rebecca, was married to her own brother, Thomas, when she turned 16. Their first child, born in 1856, was the beginning of a genetic catastrophe that would echo through 6 generations. By 1860, the Holloway family had grown to over 40 members, all living in a cluster of ramshackle cabins connected by hidden paths through the woods. They spoke their own dialect, practiced their own twisted version of religion, and lived by laws that existed nowhere else on earth. Government census takers never found them. Tax collectors learned to avoid the area after 2 went missing in consecutive years. The Civil War raged around them, but Devil's Hollow remained untouched, forgotten, a pocket of darkness growing deeper with each passing generation. Thomas Holloway, Jacob's son and husband to his own sister Rebecca, became the family's second patriarch when Jacob died in 1871. But Thomas was not his father. Where Jacob had been calculating and controlled in his depravity, Thomas was driven by something far more primitive. The decades of inbreeding had already begun to show their effects. Thomas suffered from violent mood swings, periods of complete dissociation, and what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe developmental disabilities. Under Thomas's leadership, the family's isolation became even more complete. He instituted brutal punishments for any family member caught speaking to outsiders. The few mountain trappers who occasionally stumbled across their territory reported strange sounds echoing through the valley at night, screaming, chanting, and other noises that made grown men quicken their pace and never return. The genetic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Children were being born with extra fingers, missing limbs, and facial deformities so severe that some could barely eat or breathe. But rather than seeing this as a warning, Thomas interpreted the mutations as signs of divine favor, proof that the family was becoming something beyond human, chosen for a special destiny that required complete genetic purity. Rebecca Holloway bore Thomas 11 children over 18 years. But only 6 survived past their 5th birthday. Those who did live carried the accumulated damage of 3 generations of systematic inbreeding. The family tree reconstructed decades later from medical records and testimonies reveals that by 1880, the average coefficient of inbreeding within the Holloway family was higher than that typically seen in laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic research. The 4th generation marked a turning point in the family's descent into genetic hell. Thomas's surviving children, Mary, Joseph, Samuel, Elizabeth, Ruth, and Abel, were paired off in marriages that defied every law of nature and civilization. Brother married sister, uncle married niece, and in some cases, fathers took their own daughters as wives when no other suitable partners could be found within the bloodline. The resulting children were living testaments to humanity's genetic limits. Many were born with conditions so severe they never learned to walk, speak, or even recognize their own reflections. But it was in this 4th generation that Sarah was born, the young woman who would eventually walk into that Virginia hospital carrying the most inbred child in medical history. Sarah was the product of a union between her grandfather Joseph and her Aunt Elizabeth, making her both a great-granddaughter and a granddaughter to the same man. The genetic counselor, who later analyzed her family tree, would spend 3 days mapping the connections before finally throwing his hands up and declaring the whole structure genetically impossible, yet somehow real. Sarah Holloway entered the world in 1912, with odds already stacked impossibly against her. Born to parents who shared over 75% of their DNA, a genetic overlap that shouldn't occur outside of identical twins, she was a walking miracle of survival wrapped in a nightmare of hereditary damage. Her birth weight was barely 3 pounds. Her skull was misshapen, and her left arm ended at the elbow in a tangle of underdeveloped bone and tissue. But Sarah lived, and that itself was extraordinary. Of the 12 children born to her parents over 15 years, only 3 survived past infancy, and Sarah was the only one capable of something resembling normal cognitive function. She learned to walk at 4, spoke her first words at 6, and by the time she reached adolescence, she had become something of a prodigy within the twisted confines of Devil's Hollow, a young woman who could read the few moldering books the family possessed and even write simple letters in a cramped, unsteady hand. The family patriarch by Sarah's time was her great-uncle Abel, a man whose own genetic damage had left him nearly 7 feet tall, but with the mental capacity of a child. Abel ruled through fear and superstition, preaching a warped gospel that proclaimed the family's deformities as holy stigmata, marks of God's special attention that would eventually transform them into angels on earth. Under his leadership, the family's religious practices had devolved into something that would have horrified even their ancestors. Rituals involving blood, bones, and acts that medical professionals still refuse to discuss in detail. When Sarah turned 18 in 1930, Abel chose her husband in the traditional family manner by drawing lots among her male relatives. The winner was her own Uncle Marcus, a man 43 years her senior, who had already produced 6 severely disabled children with 2 of his nieces. Marcus was himself the product of 3 generations of sibling marriages, and his genetic profile read like a catalog of everything that could go wrong with human DNA. The wedding ceremony conducted by Abel in the family's makeshift chapel was witnessed by 37 family members, most of whom bore visible signs of the genetic catastrophe that had consumed their bloodline. Photographs from that day, discovered in a trunk buried behind the family cemetery, show faces that seem almost alien in their deformity. Eyes set at impossible angles, limbs twisted into unnatural positions, and expressions of vacant confusion suggest minds struggling to process a reality their damaged brains could never fully comprehend. Sarah's first pregnancy came quickly, but ended in miscarriage at 6 months, when the fetus was found to have developed without a functioning brain stem. Her second pregnancy lasted only 4 months before her body spontaneously aborted a child that medical records describe only as incompatible with life. But her third pregnancy, the one that would take her to that Virginia hospital, was different. This child not only survived to full term but seemed to be developing normally, at least according to the crude examinations performed by the family's self-appointed midwife, Marcus' sister, Delilah, who had learned her skills delivering the damaged offspring of Devil's Hollow for over 3 decades. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? By October of 1932, Something inside Sarah had changed. Maybe it was maternal instinct, or maybe it was the first glimmer of sanity breaking through 6 generations of genetic fog. But she began to understand that the child growing inside her deserved a chance at life that Devil's Hollow could never provide. The family's recent births had been increasingly horrific. Bobbies born with organs on the outside of their bodies. Children with faces so malformed they couldn't breathe. Infants whose bones were so brittle they broke during delivery. Sarah made her decision during what the family called the night of screaming when Marcus' latest child, born to his 14-year-old niece, lived for 6 agonizing hours while its underdeveloped lungs slowly filled with fluid. As the infant's cries echoed through the valley, growing weaker with each passing hour, Sarah felt something snap inside her mind. She would not let her child become another casualty of the family's twisted legacy. Her escape plan was simple but desperate. During the new moon in late October, when the valley was darkest, and the family patriarch Abel was deep in one of his religious trances, Sarah slipped away from the compound with nothing but the clothes on her back and $17 she had stolen from Marcus' hidden stash. She had never been more than 5 miles from Devil's Hollow in her entire life, but desperation gave her courage that 20 years of conditioning had never allowed. The journey nearly killed her. 8 months pregnant and weakened by a lifetime of malnutrition, Sarah walked for 3 days through mountain wilderness that would challenge an experienced hiker. She survived on berries and stream water, sleeping in caves and hollow logs, driven forward by an obsession that bordered on madness, the absolute certainty that her child deserved better than the genetic hell it had been conceived in. When she finally stumbled out of the woods onto a proper road, Sarah was delirious with exhaustion and fever. A traveling salesman named Robert Welsh found her collapsed beside his automobile, mumbling incoherently about devils and angels and bobbies that screamed with voices like broken glass. Welsh, a decent man with daughters of his own, loaded Sarah into his car and drove straight to the nearest hospital, never suspecting that he was transporting the end result of America's most horrifying genetic experiment. At St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah registered under the false name Mary Smith, a deception that worked only because her condition was so obviously desperate that no one questioned her story of being an abandoned wife with no family to contact. The nursing staff, accustomed to dealing with mountain folk who were often suspicious of modern medicine, accepted her strange dialect and bizarre explanations for her obvious genetic abnormalities. What they couldn't accept, what none of them were prepared for, was what emerged from her womb on November 15th, when Sarah's labor finally began after 3 days of complications that baffled the medical team. Dr. Margaret Hayes had delivered over 3,000 bobbies in her 30-year career, but nothing in her medical training had prepared her for what she witnessed in Delivery Room 3 on that cold November night. The labor itself had been unusually difficult. Sarah's pelvis was malformed from her own genetic damage, and the baby seemed to be positioned in ways that defied normal obstetric knowledge. But it was when the child finally emerged that Dr. Hayes understood she was looking at something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The infant was alive, but barely recognizable as human. Its skull was elongated and partially collapsed on one side, giving the head an almost triangular shape that made the oversized eyes appear to bulge from their sockets. The left arm was completely absent, ending at the shoulder in smooth skin, while the right arm had 7 fingers arranged in a pattern that suggested the limb had attempted to develop as 2 separate appendages. Most disturbing of all were the child's legs, which were fused together from the hip down in a single mass of flesh that contained what appeared to be 3 separate sets of bones. But the physical deformities were only the beginning of the horror. As Dr. Hayes performed her initial examination, she realized that the child's internal anatomy was equally catastrophic. The heart was beating, but its rhythm was chaotic and irregular, suggesting severe structural abnormalities. The breathing was labored and shallow, indicating that the lungs were either underdeveloped or positioned incorrectly within the chest cavity. Most troubling of all, the infant showed no response to light, sound, or touch. Its nervous system appeared to be so damaged that it existed in a state that could barely be called consciousness. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize the child, but their efforts were hampered by the fact that normal pediatric procedures simply didn't apply. Standard oxygen delivery methods were useless because of the malformed facial structure. IV insertion was nearly impossible due to the absence of normal vein placement. Even basic measurements were challenging. How do you weigh a child whose body seems to exist in dimensions that don't conform to standard human anatomy? Dr. Hayes made the decision to call in Dr. Edmund Carver, a geneticist from the University of Virginia, who had been studying hereditary disorders in isolated populations. Carver arrived within hours, took one look at the infant, and immediately began documenting what he would later describe as the most extreme case of genetic compression ever recorded in medical literature. He estimated that the child's parents shared over 90% of their DNA, a level of genetic similarity that approached the theoretical limits of what human reproduction could produce. The child lived for exactly 17 minutes. During that brief span, Dr. Carver managed to collect tissue samples and photograph the infant from every possible angle, creating a record that would later become the foundation for groundbreaking research into the effects of extreme inbreeding on human development. But as the child's chaotic heartbeat finally stopped, everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed something that transcended normal medical experience. They had seen the ultimate consequence of humanity's darkest impulses made flesh. Sarah, sedated and exhausted from the traumatic delivery, was told only that her baby had been born with severe complications and had not survived. She accepted this news with a strange calmness that unsettled the nursing staff, as if some part of her had always known that her child was doomed from the moment of conception. Dr. Carver's research into the Holloway family case would span the next 40 years of his career, but it was research conducted in absolute secrecy. The genetic data he had collected was so disturbing, so far beyond the boundaries of normal human variation, that he feared its publication would either be dismissed as fabrication or, worse, used to justify the kind of eugenic policies that were gaining popularity in 1930s America. Instead, he locked his findings away in a private vault, sharing them only with a handful of trusted colleagues who were sworn to secrecy. Sarah herself disappeared from the hospital 3 days after giving birth, leaving behind only a note written in her cramped handwriting. "The devil's work is done. I go to make peace with God." Hospital staff assumed she had returned to whatever mountain community she had come from, but the truth was far more tragic. Sarah's body was found 2 weeks later at the bottom of a ravine, 50 miles from the hospital. Her death was ruled a suicide by local authorities, who never connected her to the mysterious case at St. Mary's. The Hall family story might have ended there, buried along with Sarah in an unmarked grave, if not for a series of coincidences that began to unfold in the 1970s. Genealogical researchers working on Appalachian family histories began to notice strange gaps in the historical record. Entire bloodlines seemed to vanish without explanation, Census data showed impossible family relationships, and local legends spoke of a cursed valley where the devil himself was said to walk among the living. In 1984, Dr. Carver finally broke his silence. Now in his 80s and facing terminal cancer, he decided that the world needed to know about the Holloway family, not as a curiosity or a source of horrified fascination, but as a warning about the ultimate consequences of genetic isolation. His published paper, titled Extreme Consanguinity in an Isolated Population, a case study in genetic collapse, appeared in the Journal of Human Genetics and immediately became one of the most controversial publications in the field's history. The paper revealed that the Holloway family represented something unprecedented in medical literature, a genetic bottleneck so severe that it had essentially created a new category of human being, one so far removed from normal human genetics that reproduction with outsiders would have been virtually impossible, even if the family had desired it. The child born to Sarah in 1932 wasn't just severely deformed. It was the product of a genetic experiment that had been running unchecked for nearly a century, an inadvertent study in the absolute limits of human heredity. Devil's Hollow itself was finally discovered by researchers in 1987, nearly 60 years after Sarah's escape. The valley was empty by then, its ramshackle buildings collapsed and overgrown, its secrets buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and mountain silence. The family cemetery contained over 200 graves, most unmarked, many containing the remains of infants and children whose lives had been cut short by the genetic catastrophe their ancestors had unleashed. Today, the Holloway case stands as both a scientific landmark and a moral cautionary tale. Modern geneticists study Dr. Carver's data to better understand the mechanisms of genetic disease, while ethicists use the family story to illustrate the importance of genetic diversity in human populations. But perhaps most importantly, the story serves as a reminder that some secrets are too terrible to keep hidden, and that the cost of isolation, genetic, social, or moral, can echo through generations long after the original sins have been forgotten. The most inbred child ever born lived for only 17 minutes, but its legacy continues to shape our understanding of human genetics nearly a century later. In those brief moments of life, that unnamed infant carried within its damaged cells the accumulated weight of 6 generations of family secrets, a living testament to the darkest corners of human nature and the terrible price of keeping some truths buried in the shadows.